Martin and Elena met on board a huge cruise ship where they had both worked for 8 years. He was a knowledgeable engineer, capable of solving any technical problems on the ship, while she worked with passengers and was known for her friendly attitude to everyone around her. Their work at sea required great sacrifices, long weeks away from shore and friends, constant change of time zones, but they found in each other not only love, but also support that helped them cope with difficulties. There was much joy and love in their relationship. Martin was a man serious, but with Elena he loosened up, joked, laughed, as if he became another person. She, in turn, saw him as a support, which could be relied on in any situation. They spent free hours together on board, dreamed about the future, imagined how one day they would leave the life on the sea and settle in the house they had recently bought, where they would raise their children and enjoy a quiet family life. But during the next voyage, something changed. Martin began to notice that Elena became more aloof. Before, she was always seeking his company, sharing her thoughts and experiences. But now she was increasingly alone. At crew parties, she no longer laughed at his jokes as she used to. Her eyes were often empty and her smile strained. One evening, as they sat together on the deck enjoying the sunset, Martin couldn't resist asking her what was going on. He tried to speak softly, not accusing, but his heart clenched with a premonition of trouble. Elena, who had been silent for a long time, finally replied that everything was fine, that she was just tired. But her gaze, full of sadness and anxiety, spoke of something else. Martin felt that he was losing her, but did not know what to do about it. One evening, when Elena once again left early from their shared outing, he noticed her walk up to another crew member, Victor, a new employee who had recently joined their team. Martin saw them talking, and there was something in their interaction that he hadn't noticed before. Victor was a man of flamboyant charisma, always surrounded by attention, and now that attention belonged to Elena. Martin tried to convince himself that this was just a friendly conversation, but his heart already knew the truth. He watched Elena walk away with Victor, feeling the chill of alienation creep into his soul. He began to realize that their 8 years of happiness might be over, that their shared dreams might be shattered, and that realization was unbearable. Every day, Elena grew more distant, and Martin felt his world crumbling. He tried to talk to her, but all his attempts ran into a wall of silence and evasive answers. The sincerity and warmth that had always been the foundation of their relationship was gone. Martin began to suffer from insomnia, constantly thinking about what had gone wrong, what he might have missed. Their last evening before the start of the new flight was particularly difficult. Martin had offered Helena to spend time together, but she had declined, citing the need to prepare for tomorrow. There was nothing unusual in her words, but there was the same emptiness in her eyes as there had been for the last few weeks. He stood alone on the deck, looking up at the stars, and felt his heart fill with anxiety and sadness. He realized that there were challenges ahead of them that they might not be able to overcome. This voyage was the beginning of the end for their love, but Martin did not yet know how painful this journey would be, and that soon his life would change forever. As the new 11-week flight began, the tension between Martin and Helena reached a breaking point. For the first week, they barely spoke to each other, and Martin increasingly felt his love slipping away. He couldn't understand what was happening, but a sense of unease haunted him day and night. That all changed one night when he decided to find out the truth at all costs. Martin found Elena in the cabin, sitting on the bed, immersed in thought. He sat down next to her, trying to approach the conversation gently. "Elena, we've been together for 8 years. What's going on with us? You've distanced yourself from me, and I can't understand why. Don't you want to talk to me anymore?" Elena was silent for a long time, her eyes glistening with tears. She sighed. Then, determined, she spoke. "Martin, I don't know how to tell you this. I didn't mean for this to happen, but..." Her voice trembled. "I've met someone else." These words sounded to Martin like a stroke of thunder. He tried to digest what he had heard, but he couldn't believe it. "Who?" he whispered, trying to remain calm. "Victor," she answered, lowering her head. We started chatting on the last flight, and I couldn't resist. He's so different. He understands me, Martin. I can't hide it anymore." Martin felt his heart clench with pain. He didn't know how to react. His world was crumbling, and he was helpless before this catastrophe. "You say he understands you? What about me? All these years, haven't I been there for you? Didn't I love you?" Martin felt his voice getting louder and louder, but he couldn't stop. "Did I deserve this?" Helena tried to soothe him, but he pulled away, unable to bear her touch. He jumped up from the bed and left the cabin, leaving her alone, consumed by his thoughts and pain. The next day, Martin saw them together. Victor and Helena stood at the railing on the upper deck, their faces close and their hands intertwined. In that moment, Martin realized that it wasn't just attraction, it was more than that. They looked happy, and the sight tormented his heart. He wanted to leave, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. Elena and Victor were growing closer and closer. They began to spend every spare moment together, and Martin unwittingly witnessed their burgeoning passion. Soon, everything on the ship was saying that there was more going on between them than just friendship. One night, as Martin searched for Elena, he heard muffled sounds coming from a neighboring cabin. His heart sank when he recognized her voice. He stepped closer and opened the door ajar. Elena and Victor were together. Their bodies were entwined in a passionate dance, and Martin felt his world finally crumble. Helena was completely engrossed in Victor, her hands sliding over his body, her breathing intermittent and her eyes closed with pleasure. She had found in him what she had lost with Martin, and that realization tore at his soul. Martin couldn't bear the sight and quickly closed the door. His heart was beating so hard he thought it would jump out of his chest. He was furious and desperate, not knowing how to deal with these emotions. He retreated to the deck, trying to collect his thoughts. He wanted to scream, to vent all the pain, but he knew it wouldn't help. He was a prisoner on this ship, and he couldn't leave. Victor seemed to have taken everything from him: his love, his future, his dreams. Martin's feelings struggled inside. He loved Elena, but her betrayal was tearing him apart. He wanted to forgive her, to return everything to the way it was, but he realized it was impossible. Victor and Elena were already on their way to a new beginning, leaving him behind, and he was alone with the devastation and pain that was eating away at him from the inside. Nor on the ship had become unbearable for Martin. His pain, like an ocean, flooded his soul, preventing him from breathing. Every morning he woke up with the hope that it would all be just a nightmare, but reality reminded him of what had happened again and again. Victor and Elena were not just together now. They had become a couple that openly showed their feelings in front of the entire crew. Martin saw them together at every turn, in the mess hall, on deck, at evening events. They laughed, touched each other as if nothing else around them existed. It was a sight that tore his heart apart. The work that used to help him distract himself was now a torture. Martin was constantly bumping into Victor on job duties, and each time it was excruciating. Victor tried to act composed, but Martin could sense something more in his gaze. Triumph, as if he had won a fight Martin didn't even know he was waging. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Martin decided to seclude himself at the stern of the ship, where it was quiet and almost no one was around. He sat looking out at the vast horizon, trying to calm the storm in his soul. But soon the silence was broken by voices. He turned around and saw them. Elena and Victor were standing at the railing, pressed tightly against each other, her arms wrapped around his neck. Their lips were so close that it seemed like just a moment before they would kiss. Martin felt something inside him break. He wanted to leave, but his legs wouldn't obey him, so he remained standing in the shadows, watching them. Helena was saying something to Victor quietly, her voice full of the tenderness that she used to give Martin. Victor leaned toward her and ran his hand through her hair, and Martin clenched his fists, feeling jealousy overwhelm him. Helena seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she had recently shared those same feelings with Martin. She was completely engrossed in Victor, and it was evident in her eyes, in the way she reached for him. Their kiss was passionate, long, and Martin felt his heart fill with unbearable pain. It was like a suffocation he couldn't shake off. He wanted to go over, to break their embrace, to demand an explanation, but he realized that it wouldn't change anything. He had already lost, and now all that was left was to accept that his love, his 8 years of history, was ruined. From then on, Martin avoided them as best he could. He could no longer look at their happiness. It had become to him an unbearable reminder of his own loss. But avoiding them was impossible. The ship that had once been home to him was now a prison. There was no place in the confined space of the ocean where he could hide from his pain. One night, when Martin could not sleep again, he heard footsteps outside his cabin door. He moved closer and heard muffled voices. His heart sank when he recognized them. It was Helena and Victor. They were laughing, their voices filled with happiness. Martin knew that they had spent the night together again, and that knowledge was eating him up from the inside out. He couldn't take it anymore. Martin began to leave the cabin only when he was sure he wouldn't meet them. He spent his time in the engine room, checking systems that hadn't needed attention in a long time. Work had become his only salvation, however temporary. He immersed himself in it to forget himself, but every morning when he came back to reality, he felt the pain again and again, like a fresh wound. This went on for weeks, and every minute on that ship was a test for Martin. He felt like a prisoner, trapped in his own memories, in a past that could never return. Elena seemed happy, but that happiness did not belong to him, and it was unbearable. Every day for Martin became a struggle with himself. He knew that if nothing changed, he would lose himself completely. His love for Helena was now clouded by jealousy, pain, and despair. And he began to realize that in order to survive, he had to find the strength to let her go, no matter how hard it was. It had been weeks since Martin finally realized that his relationship with Elena was broken. Every day on the ship felt like an eternity. The work that used to be satisfying had become meaningless to him. He no longer found solace in it, and each new day seemed empty and lifeless. Martin tried to avoid Elena and Victor. He no longer wanted to see them together. Their happiness hurt him too much. But it was impossible to completely hide on the ship, and every time he saw them, his heart clenched with pain. The mutual glances, the touches, the laughter, it was all unbearable for him. One day, late in the evening, Martin saw them together again on the deck. Helena and Victor stood at the railing, their hands intertwined and their faces close. At that moment, they looked so happy, so absorbed in each other, that the world around them seemed to cease to exist. Martin froze, feeling a wave of rage and despair rising within him. He couldn't hold back any longer and walked towards them, stopping abruptly in front of them. Victor let go of Elena and looked at Martin with slight surprise, but no fear. Elena, on the other hand, was clearly alarmed. "How can you do this?" Martin could hardly control himself, his voice shaking with anger. "You know I'm here. You know I see everything. Do you enjoy ruining my life?" Helena stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Martin, I didn't mean for it to come out like this," she began, but Martin interrupted her. "You didn't?" His voice got louder. "What did you want, Helena? To betray me? To give everything we had to another man?" Victor stepped forward, his face serious, but this time there was more than the usual calm in his eyes. "Chill out, Martin," Victor replied, his tone icy. "You've already lost. Get over it. Elena chose me, and it's time for you to realize that I'm here for a reason. Your days are over, and the sooner you realize that, the better for you." Victor's words were like a stab to the heart. Martin couldn't take it. His fist slammed with all his might into Victor's jaw, who didn't have time to dodge. Victor staggered, but immediately regained his balance and lunged at Martin. The fight began. Their blows were strong and full of rage, each of them putting all their accumulated emotions into the fight. Elena screamed, trying to separate them, but neither man was going to stop. It was a battle not only for her, but for their own pride, for their lost love, for feeling stronger, if only for a moment, than the horror each of them felt. For a moment, Victor managed to knock Martin off his feet, pinning him to the deck. He leaned over him, breathing heavily, and hissed through clenched teeth, "It's your own fault. She was with you, But you lost her, and now she's mine." Martin, gathering his last strength, tried to pull away, but Victor held him tight. "Maybe," Martin exhaled, gasping with rage and pain. "But she'll never really need you." At that moment, Elena, sobbing, managed to pull them apart, forcing Victor to let Martin go. She stood between them, trembling with fear and pain, a sight that finally stopped both of them. Victor backed away, still breathing heavily, and Martin slowly stood up, feeling his own pain and rage slowly subside, leaving only emptiness behind. "We're done," Martin said quietly, his voice full of fatigue. "I don't want anything more from you. Just leave me alone." With these words, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena and Victor on the deck. Back in his cabin, Martin felt something inside him finally break. He realized that his old life, his relationship with Elena, it was all in the past, and there was no way to get it back. Now there was only one thing left for him: to survive this nightmare and find the strength to start again, without her, without Victor, and without those painful memories that would stay with him forever. When the voyage came to an end, Martin no longer felt like the man who had boarded this ship a few weeks ago. He was broken, exhausted, and frustrated, but at the same time, a new feeling stirred inside him, a strange and unexpected sense of freedom. He realized that he was no longer bound to the past, that something new lay ahead of him, even if that new thing was frightening in its unknown. The ship arrived in port early in the morning. All the crew members were packing their belongings, preparing to leave the ship. Martin stood at the porthole in his cabin, looking at the slowly approaching shore. His gaze was detached, his thoughts flowed slowly and calmly. He no longer thought about Elena and Victor, though he knew that they were somewhere near, preparing to leave. They ceased to exist for him, becoming mere ghosts in the pages of his past. When the ship finally docked, Martin slowly walked out onto the deck, where the other crew members were already crowded. Among them, he noticed Victor and Elena standing together, waiting for their turn to go ashore. Their gazes met for a moment, and there was no anger or pain in Martin's eyes, only weariness and indifference. Victor in turn looked at him with a slight sneer, as if to assert his victory, and Helena lowered her gaze, as if unable to bear the weight of the moment. Martin turned away and headed for the gangway. Once on the ground, he felt something inside him begin to slowly let go, as if with each step he was getting rid of the weight he had been carrying on his shoulders all these weeks. He looked back at the ship one last time, but felt nothing but relief that it was all finally behind him. He knew he had a hard road ahead of him. Returning home, to the life he once thought he had, was impossible. He would have to start over, build a new life from the ruins of the old one. But there was something refreshing about it, something that gave him the strength to move on. As Martin stepped outside the harbor, he felt a light breeze touch his face. A new day was ahead, full of opportunity and the unknown. Although he was alone, for the first time in a long time, he felt that this loneliness brought him not only pain, but also freedom. He began to walk forward slowly, his heart no longer heavy with the heaviness that had accompanied him for the past weeks. Martin knew that new challenges, new ups and downs were ahead of him, but now he was ready for it. He knew that he had survived the worst of it, and now he could start his life anew, with a clean slate, free from everything that held him back in the past. With each step, he felt his strength return. With each breath, his heart filled with life again. Even though it was a new, unfamiliar life, he was ready to face it with determination and hope for the best.